He didn't wait for the anesthesia to wear off. Renata Holloway remembered that detail more clearly than anything else. Not the fluorescent lights of the ICU, not the beeping monitors, not the strange cottony numbness spreading from her chest down her left arm. What she remembered was the exact moment her husband walked through that door, and the look on his face wasn't relief. It wasn't even guilt. It was impatience. She had flatlined twice on the operating table. The surgeon told her afterward, almost gently, like he was breaking news about someone else's life. "Twice your heart stopped, Mrs. Holloway. You're lucky to be here." And she had nodded, still not quite believing she was anywhere at all, still half convinced this room, this thin hospital blanket, this IV in the back of her hand, was something she was dreaming. Then Dex walked in and she knew she was awake because nothing in her dreams had ever made her stomach drop quite like that. Dexter Holloway was the kind of man who made rooms recalibrate when he entered them. 6'2", jaw like something carved from a legal brief, wearing the same charcoal suit he'd had on when she coded in the ambulance. She noticed that too, the suit, undisturbed, not a wrinkle out of place. He hadn't changed, hadn't been home, and yet he hadn't been here either, because she'd been alone when she woke up, the nurses giving her careful looks that said someone should be with you and isn't. "You're awake," he said. "Not thank God. Not I was so scared. Just, you're awake." "Apparently," Renata said. He pulled the chair close to the bed but didn't sit in it the way a husband sits. He sat the way a man sits across a conference table. Elbows forward, hands folded. Something decided already in his eyes. "The doctors say you're stable," he said. "That's good." She looked at him for a long moment. 23 years. She had loved this man for 23 years, and she knew every version of his face. The one he wore at charity dinners, the one he wore when he was closing a deal, the one he wore when he was lying. This was a new one. Or maybe it wasn't new at all, and she was only now seeing it clearly because she'd nearly died, and the nearly dying had burned away something that used to soften her vision. "Dex," she said. "What's happening?" He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set a folded envelope on the blanket beside her hand. Not in her hand, beside it. Like a document left for signature. She didn't open it. She already knew what it was. She could feel it the way you feel weather coming in. "I had Paul draw it up," he said. Paul was their attorney, had been their attorney. She understood from his use of the past tense who Paul belonged to now. "Everything's straightforward. The house, the accounts, you'll be taken care of, Renata. I made sure of that." She stared at the envelope. There was a water stain on the hospital ceiling shaped like the state of Florida. She focused on that. "I'm still in the ICU," she said. "I know. I had a heart attack, Dex. I'm 41 years old, and I had a heart attack. I know." He said it the same way both times, the same flat, uninflected delivery. "The way you say I know when you mean this doesn't change anything." She finally looked at him. "How long?" He didn't pretend not to understand the question. "A year," he said. "A little over. Is it Simone?" Something moved across his face, just briefly. "How did you?" "Because I'm not an idiot," Renata said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "Because she's been your assistant for 3 years and she looks at you a specific way, and I kept telling myself I was imagining it." She paused. "I was in the middle of imagining it when my heart stopped." He had the grace to look away. Renata picked up the envelope and set it on the tray table beside her water cup without opening it. "Get out of my room," she said. "Renata, I just told you to leave my room. I am in the intensive care unit. I have tubes in my arm and a monitor on my chest, and I flatlined twice yesterday, and you came here to serve me divorce papers." She let that sit in the air between them. "Get out." He left. Not quickly. That would have been too much like shame. He left at his own pace, straightening as he stood, buttoning the button on his jacket, and she watched him go and thought about the 23 years, the way they compressed suddenly into something small enough to fit in an envelope someone else's lawyer had typed up. She didn't cry until the door closed. Renata had been the kind of woman people described as practical. She'd heard it her whole life, sometimes as a compliment, sometimes not. Renata's so practical. What they usually meant was that she didn't fall apart, that she kept moving, that she had a particular talent for absorbing terrible things and continuing to function. She'd been practical when her father died during her sophomore year of college. Practical when the first pregnancy ended at 11 weeks. Practical when Dex's company nearly collapsed in 2019, and she'd spent 6 months quietly restructuring their personal finances so they wouldn't lose everything, while he was too proud to admit how bad it was. It had never occurred to her to wonder whether being practical was the same as being valued. Her sister Ren arrived that afternoon, still in her scrubs from the hospital in Baltimore where she worked, having driven 3 hours after Renata's night nurse had found Renata's emergency contact and called without telling her. Ren Holloway, Ren Aldridge now, 3 years married, came through the door with the expression of a woman who had already made several decisions on the drive down and was keeping them organized behind her eyes. "Tell me," Ren said, pulling the chair close. So Renata told her, all of it, the envelope, the suit without a wrinkle, the "I know" said twice in the same voice. When she finished, Ren sat quietly for a moment with her hands flat on her thighs. "He served you divorce papers in the ICU. He left them on my blanket. Technically, I served myself. Renata, I'm not being funny. I don't know what else to do with that information, except make it into a fact that I can look at from a distance." Ren reached out and took her hand. She didn't say anything for a while. One of the monitors beeped rhythmically. Someone in the hall was laughing. "Does he know about the Aldridge properties?" Ren asked finally. Renata was quiet. The Aldridge properties were not something she had ever hidden from Dex, exactly. But she also had not explained them in full, and he had not asked, because Dex was the kind of man who did not think of his wife as someone who might have a separate architecture of assets that predated him. Her grandmother, Ruth Aldridge, had been a woman of extremely practical investments in an era when women of a certain background were not supposed to make them. When Ruth died in 2003, she had left Renata. Not the family, not her parents, specifically Renata, because she'd recognized something in her oldest grandchild. Controlling interest in what the family called the properties. Commercial real estate, across 4 counties in Virginia, a cold storage facility that serviced half the agricultural corridor between Richmond and the coast, and 48 acres of riverfront land that had been quietly appreciated for 19 years into something staggering. Renata managed the portfolio through a separately held LLC that operated under her maiden name, Aldridge Holdings. It existed in the same legal universe as her marriage, and yet completely outside of it, structured that way intentionally by the estate attorney who'd executed Ruth's will, who had clearly been a woman of foresight. Dex's company, Holloway Capital Management, had expanded significantly in the last 4 years. He'd talked about it constantly. New clients, new offices, the second location in McLean. What he had not mentioned, and what Renata had learned through her own property manager 6 months ago without saying a word to anyone, was that Holloway Capital's McLean office sat on land that was technically leased through a shell entity that was itself a subsidiary of Aldridge Holdings. He was paying her rent, had been for 2 years. Without knowing it, she had decided not to say anything because she had not yet decided what the information meant. Now she thought perhaps it had been waiting for exactly this moment. "He has no idea," she told Ren. Ren nodded slowly. "The lease on McLean renews when?" 90 days. Another silence. The monitor beeped. "Okay," Ren said. "Okay. Don't sign anything." The thing about a cardiac event, Renata learned, was that it slowed time down in a very specific way. The days in the hospital had a particular quality of suspension, like being inside a snow globe someone had set down. Visitors came, her mother, her college roommate, a few people from the non-profit board she sat on. They brought flowers and careful faces, and she thanked them and watched them try not to look at the monitor. She read, she slept, she thought. She did not open the envelope. On the 5th day, a woman appeared in the doorway of her hospital room. Not a nurse, she was in street clothes, a tan blazer, dark hair pulled back, a leather bag over one shoulder. She was maybe 35 and carried herself with the particular self-possession of someone who billed by the hour. "Mrs. Holloway, I'm Theodora Vance. Your sister asked me to come." Renata glanced past her. "Where is Ren?" "Parking. She'll be up." Theodora Vance set her bag on the windowsill and looked at Renata with calm, assessing eyes. "I do family law. I've handled high-asset divorce cases for 15 years, primarily in Virginia and D.C. Ren told me some of the basics. I'd like to hear the rest from you if you're willing." Renata studied her. "You drove down from D.C.? Ren was very persuasive. She usually is. Renata adjusted herself against the pillow. Close the door. She told Theodora everything. The portfolio, the LLC, the McLean property, the lease. Theodora listened without interrupting, taking no notes, which Renata noticed. Afterward, she asked 3 questions, very precise, about the structure of Aldridge Holdings and its relationship to Renata's marriage date. Then she sat back. "Your grandmother's attorney was excellent," she said. "I've thought that many times. The properties were inherited. They've been maintained separately. The LLC predates your marriage, and your husband has no documented claim. Virginia's a dual classification state. Separate property that's properly maintained stays separate." She paused. "The complication is going to be the McLean lease, because he's going to find out eventually, and his attorney is going to argue that your concealment of a material financial relationship constitutes bad faith." "I didn't conceal it. I simply didn't point it out." Theodora's mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile but was close. "I know. We're going to have a long and productive relationship, I think." Wren arrived 17 minutes later with a tray of coffees she'd walked half a mile to find, which was exactly the kind of thing Wren did. And the 3 of them spent 2 hours in the snow globe suspension of that hospital room, constructing the beginning of a different future than the one that had been left folded on the blanket 5 days ago. She was discharged on a Tuesday with a list of medications, a cardiac rehabilitation schedule, and an envelope she still hadn't opened. She opened it in the car, alone, in the hospital parking garage, because she didn't want to do it at home, and she didn't want to do it in front of anyone. She read it once, carefully, the way she read everything. Then she put it in the glove compartment and drove herself home. The house was a colonial on 4 acres outside of Charlottesville. They'd bought it 11 years ago, the year Dex's business finally crossed into real profitability, and she had poured herself into it in the way people pour themselves into things when they're not sure what else to do with their energy. The garden, the renovation of the back wing, the kitchen she'd redesigned twice. It was a beautiful house. She had made it beautiful. She walked through it now with different eyes. Dex was not there. He had moved, she learned from his assistant. Not Simone, a different one, a young man named Oliver, who had the brittle politeness of someone caught between 2 people in a war he hadn't started, into a corporate apartment in the city. She had heard this from Oliver because Dex had not told her himself, because in his understanding of the situation was already resolved. He had left the envelope. She would sign the papers. They would proceed. She did not sign the papers. She planted the back garden instead. Tomatoes, late for the season, probably foolish. But she needed her hands in the dirt, and she didn't have anything else to do with the afternoons, and her cardiologist had said light activity, and she decided this counted. Her neighbor from down the road, a retired postal worker named Al, leaned on the fence one evening while she was at it and said, "Heard you were in the hospital. You doing all right?" "Getting there," she said. "Garden's looking good. It'll look better in August." He nodded and went on, and she felt something loosen slightly in her chest that was not cardiac in origin. 6 weeks after the hospital, Theodora filed a response to the divorce petition that Dex's attorney, a man named Hartwell who Renata remembered from dinner parties and now assessed with new eyes, had apparently not anticipated. The response included a preliminary financial disclosure from Aldridge Holdings. She heard about Dex's reaction secondhand, through Wren, who had it from Theodora. He'd read through the disclosure 3 times, and then asked his attorney to explain the McLean property. Hartwell had explained it. There was a meeting requested. Renata declined to attend, but instructed Theodora to convey that she was available when the cardiac rehabilitation schedule permitted, which ran Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Then she went to her Tuesday morning rehabilitation and walked on a treadmill at an incline of 4 degrees and thought about her grandmother. Ruth Aldridge had been married to a man who'd spent money faster than he made it, who had invested poorly twice and recovered both times only because Ruth had a separate account she'd maintained since before the marriage, that her husband never asked about directly because certain men of a certain generation didn't, and Ruth had understood without being told that a woman needed a room of her own in the financial sense, a space that couldn't be touched or eroded or apologized away. She had built that room carefully and maintained it quietly, and then she had handed it to Renata, who had received it with gratitude and not fully understood until now what she'd actually been given. She'd been given the ability to survive the thing she'd thought would destroy her. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize at first, and then did. Simone's cell, which she had from a group text about a work event 3 years ago that she'd never deleted for no particular reason. "I need to talk to you." Renata looked at the text for a long time. She was on the treadmill. 4 degrees, her heart rate was 124, which the monitor on her finger said was appropriate. She didn't respond. Simone Farrow showed up at the house on a Saturday morning in September. Renata knew it was her because she watched from the upstairs window for a moment before going to the door. A woman in her early 30s, dark coat, looking at the house the way people look at places they've thought about a lot but have never actually been. She looked, Renata thought, with something like detached clarity, nervous. Good. She went downstairs and opened the door. Simone Farrow in person was prettier than Renata had imagined, and more obviously miserable. She had the particular exhaustion of someone who had made a decision that had seemed like the beginning of something and was now understanding it was the middle of something much more complicated. "I know you don't owe me anything," she said. She had clearly rehearsed this opening. I need you to know some things. About Dex. About what he said to me, about what he said to you," Renata repeated. "He told me he was already separated. A year ago, when this started, he said you'd been effectively separated for 2 years, that the marriage was over and everything but paperwork, that you'd both agreed to." She stopped. Her jaw moved. "He lied to me." Renata looked at her. The morning was cool. The leaves on the oak at the end of the drive were turning. She felt very still. "He lied to you," she said. "I know that's not your problem. I know I'm part of. I know. But I thought you should know that he didn't tell me the truth, and I didn't know, and I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to hear it from me." Renata considered her for a moment. "Did he promise you anything? Specifically?" Simone looked at the ground. "He said yes, he was specific. And now?" The pause was its own answer. "Has he told you anything about the divorce proceedings?" Renata asked. "No, he doesn't. He's been very closed off." Since July. Since July was when Theodora had filed the response. Renata kept her face still. "I'm sorry this happened to you," she said, and meant it not entirely, but enough of it was true. "You should talk to an attorney." She paused. "Specifically about the things he promised you. In writing, if there's anything in writing." Something shifted in Simone's expression. "You think there's something? I think you should talk to an attorney," Renata said again. "That's all I'm telling you." She closed the door and stood in the foyer for a moment, with her hand on the doorframe. Through the sidelight she could see Simone standing at the end of the front walk, not moving yet, just standing there in the cool September air, with her dark coat and her recalculating expression. She made her own choices, Renata thought. And now she's making new ones. She went to make coffee. The mediation was scheduled for October. Dex arrived with Hartwell, and a composure that she could see, even across the table, was costing him something. He looked at her the way you look at someone who has become, without warning, a different category of person than you thought they were. Theodora had been precise and methodical in the weeks leading up to this. She had documented the full scope of Aldridge Holdings, with the help of an independent valuation firm. She had engaged a lease analyst to produce a formal assessment of the McLean property relationship. She had, in her quiet and efficient way, constructed a picture of Renata's actual financial position that was substantially different from the picture Dex had presented to his attorney when he filed the original petition. He had, it emerged, been planning this for longer than a year. Hartwell had filed for discovery on the household accounts, and in reviewing those filings, Theodora had found a pattern of asset transfers to a separate account that predated Dex's stated timeline. He had been preparing. He had been methodical about it. He had sat across from her at dinner, 2, 3, 4 months before her heart attack, already knowing what he intended, already moving money, and had looked at her the same face he always wore. She didn't let herself feel that too directly at the table. She felt it later, at home, standing at the kitchen counter with a glass of water, and it was a specific kind of grief that she couldn't name exactly. Not for him, she thought, but for the version of herself that had been so practical, so capable, so good at absorbing terrible things, that she had never thought to look directly at the thing growing in the room with her. The mediation lasted 4 hours. Dex had wanted the colonial. Hartwell had structured a case around his years of contribution to the household and the mortgage. Theodora had produced a chain of title demonstrating that the down payment had come from an Aldridge Holdings distribution in 2013, which made the house not marital property, but Renata's separate asset improperly characterized at the time of purchase. She watched Dex understand this. It was not satisfying in the way she might have expected. It was simply true. The house was hers because the money had always been hers, because her grandmother had made sure there was money that was always hers, and the fact that Dex hadn't known, or hadn't asked, or hadn't thought to ask, was not her responsibility to have corrected. By the end of the session, the parameters had shifted significantly. Hartwell asked for a 30-day continuance to reassess their position. Theodora agreed with a graciousness that had no warmth in it whatsoever. In the parking lot afterward, walking to her car, Renata became aware of footsteps behind her and turned. Dex had followed her out. He was 5 feet away, hands in his pockets, and he looked older than he had in the hospital in March. She didn't know if that was time or circumstance, or just that she was seeing him without the previous softness. "I didn't know about the properties," he said, "not the full picture." "I know. I wouldn't have." He stopped. Whatever the end of that sentence was going to be, he couldn't finish it. "You would have done exactly this," Renata said. "Just with different math." He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that might have been the beginning of something honest, but she had been reading his face for 23 years, and she was done translating it. She got in her car and drove home. November came. The tomatoes had yielded more than she'd expected for the late planting. She'd given bags of them to Al, to her mother, to the couple 3 houses down who had a new baby and no time for the grocery store. The garden was done for the year now, put to bed under a layer of mulch, and she'd started making plans for spring. More beds along the south wall, maybe a small greenhouse. The cardiologist said her heart was recovering well, better than expected, and she had graduated from cardiac rehabilitation in October with a clean bill of functional capacity, which her physician had expressed with actual enthusiasm, and which Renata had received with something quieter. Just the simple, bone-deep gratitude of being here. She was sitting on the back porch on a Sunday afternoon with a novel she wasn't quite reading when her phone rang. "Theodora, final offer came in," Theodora said without preamble. They had reached a shorthand by now, the two of them. "He's conceding the house and the McLean issue. He wants the retirement account split at 60-40 his favor and a waiver on the transfer claims." "The retirement accounts are marital," Renata said. "Yes. He knows that. He's hoping you want this finished more than you want to fight over 4 years of 401k contributions." She thought about it. She looked at the garden, mulched and quiet. She thought about the oak going bare at the end of the drive, about the tomatoes she'd grown half out of grief and half out of something she couldn't name, about her grandmother Ruth putting money in a separate account before her husband could spend it, about practical women making sure there was always somewhere to stand. "Split it at 50-50, and he pays Theodora's fees," she said. "And I want it closed before Christmas." There was a brief silence. "He'll agree to that. I know he will. Renata, you handled this extraordinarily well." She thought about the ICU, the envelope on the blanket, the monitor beeping, his face with the impatience already in it. She thought about Flatline twice and You're Lucky to Be Here and the snow globe suspension of those hospital days. "My grandmother handled it," she said. "I just showed up." She hung up the phone and sat with the quiet afternoon for a while. The light was going. The oak at the end of the drive had 2 leaves left on it, hanging on past their season, which she understood completely. She went inside to start dinner, and the house, her house, it had always been her house, held her the way it always had, steady and familiar, as if it had been waiting all along for exactly this, for her to finally come home and know it.